Let's get started. So everyone, thanks for joining us. Welcome to the first live webinar of our DevLogue podcast, community podcast, by the Apache DevLake people. So a quick intro for our community and the host and our guest today. So my name is Henry. I'm chief maintainer at Apache DevLake. So Apache DevLake is an open source project for engineering intelligence, so collecting data, surfacing insights for engineering teams to better understand their engineering productivity and developer happiness and how to improve it through data. So joining me today is my co-host and my colleague, Emo. Emo, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Henry. Yeah, so I'm Ann Maldas. I work very, very closely with Henry on the Apache DevLake project. I'm also VP of Sales and Product over at Merico, the parent company behind DevLake. And yeah, I couldn't be more excited for yet another episode of our growing DevLogue podcast, and then our first live webinar. So super excited, Max, for joining us and all of our audience this morning. So thanks for joining us this Wednesday morning.
Awesome. And for today, we have a very special guest. So last year, I think in the developer productivity and happiness space, there's a big publication, LinkedIn open source, the developer productivity and happiness framework, which is incredibly hands-on and actionable framework, derived from their real-world experience and designed to help, organizations to enhance their developer efficiency, effectiveness, and satisfaction, through well-defined goals, metrics, and guidelines. And today, on our first live webinar, we have one of its creators, Max, joining us. So Max is principal staff and software engineer at LinkedIn, and he's also the author of two very great programming books, Understanding Software and Code Simplicity, the Fundamentals of Software. So Max, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome on the show.
Thanks so much. I'm so glad to be here.
Great. So I'd like to start an interview just to maybe from the very basics. So Max, if you can start telling us a bit about maybe yourself and your journey. And then for those who aren't familiar, can you also explain what a LinkedIn Developer Productivity and Happiness Framework is?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm one of the tech leads for developer productivity at LinkedIn. My team in particular focuses on data. One of its focuses is on data around engineering and developer productivity and happiness across the company. I've had many different roles. I was the chief architect of the Bugzilla project once upon a time. I was the technical lead for Code Health at Google for a while, and now I do this. And the framework is a collection of the things that we have learned and the principles that we have developed around how you understand and measure developer productivity and happiness, or sort of the inverse also, how do you understand their pain points and take action on those things?
Awesome. Can you tell us a bit more about what are some key components of the framework? And then how can people start implementing the frameworks in their organization?
Sure. So the framework starts off with the description of goals, signals, and metrics, which I think is the most important part of the whole system. Because there's a lot of people in the world who have a lot of trouble coming up with metrics. What we discovered is that most of the time, if you look at a timeline of like when people asked for a metric to when it was finally delivered on a dashboard, most of the time was like arguing about what the metric should be. And that is clarified almost entirely by this framework and is basically solved by this framework, and then also by like appointing a decider who just makes the decision and not trying to make it a big consensus process. Like somebody just needs to decide what the metric is going to be. And in fact, a lot of what we discovered is that when people can't determine what their metric is, it's because they don't have clearly defined and measurable goals. They need to first clarify their goals. And so we talk about that up front. We also talk about the developer personas system that we have, where we've split our developer population by workflows that they do. And then we split our survey analysis by that, and we split certain other analyses that we do by that. And we also do prioritization with that framework. So we prioritize You know, we think of iOS developers as a group, or Android developers, web developers, you know, Java backend developers, all these different things as different and equal categories of people, even though they might not be numerically identical in the business. Like LinkedIn employs many more Java backend software engineers than it does iOS developers. However, obviously the LinkedIn iOS application is a very important and critical part of our business. And we need to be able to deliver software just as effectively for iOS as we do for Java.
Mhm.
And so it's important to think about that, because otherwise if you just think of all developers as one blob, it's easy to get lost. And then it goes into principles around metrics design and how you would think about that, both as a leader who's thinking about metrics and then also as the team that has to implement them. Like, what are some of the very specific details and things you need to think about when you are actually like creating these metric pipelines?
Mm.
And finally, it covers examples, concrete
Mm.
examples, and principles that we use to come up with those specific example metrics. Those aren't all the metrics that we measure; they're just specific examples that seemed like people could relate to them externally.
Exactly. So I think one thing that we encounter a lot when we talk to our Apache DevLake users is people will come directly to metrics. You know, the first question they ask us, you know, what metrics would you recommend us using when implementing DevLake, right? So I think that's really, I think a really important point for the goals, signal, and metrics framework is that you want to start from the goals and not directly coming to metrics. So can you give us one example, maybe like how to start from the goals and derive the signals, and then finally coming up with the metrics that actually measures the goals and signals. And then I think that one example will be extremely helpful for us to grasp on the goals, signals, and metrics framework.
Yeah, sure. So there's an example in the framework itself. So I'm going to pull it up and I'm just going to reuse that example because I've already worked through it.
Yeah.
And that is the example for developer productivity, right? So at LinkedIn, the way we framed this goal is developers at LinkedIn are productive and happy. So that's the highest level framing of it, right? But the problem is productive doesn't mean anything. Like, this is the biggest problem people have with measuring productivity. The word is meaningless. Like, productive is like it's like a vague concept. Like, what does that mean? So we break down productive into something more concrete, and we say developers at LinkedIn are able to effectively and efficiently accomplish their intentions regarding LinkedIn software systems. That's a concrete goal for productive. And the key parts of that are effective, efficient, intentions, and software systems. So that clarifies what we're measuring. It clarifies why we're measuring it. It clarifies what the intent of measuring it and what action we're gonna take based on measuring it. And then for happy, we say developers at LinkedIn are happy with the tools, systems, processes, facilities, and activities involved in software development at LinkedIn. So that gives us specifically what they're happy about. Like, you know, people may be varying levels of happy in their life. That's not the thing that I'm asking them about. I'm asking them about something concrete about work. And the reason that I'm asking them about that is that it reflects on their productivity and our ability to actually operate as a business. Yes, I want them to be happy. I care about them as people. Me personally, I would like to work in a place where I like working. But there's also a very concrete business reason to have that. So then let's take that first signal. So let's say we want to have, so we say efficient and effective. Let's break that down. These are our signals. So we have two aspects of this goal, efficient and effective, and then sort of this, and it's about intentions, right? So we take one signal, the time from when a developer starts taking an action to when they accomplish what they were intending to accomplish with that action. Now, and that's very, like, if you get into that, it's very technical. And like every word in that signal kind of matters, because that's why we have the intention thing. And we have to also remember that it's always in the context of our software systems. So they're taking some action regarding our software systems. So the simplest one, obviously the one that everybody knows about and measures, is build time, right?
Mm.
But often, often with build time and with other things too, there's this question about what's the start time and what's the end point? Like, when do you start measuring the thing and when do you end measuring the thing? And like, imagine that you had a remote build system, right? And you just measured how long the remote build workers take.
Mm.
That would actually not meet this definition, because you need to measure from the moment the developer expressed the intention, I would like you to build this software, until the moment they got the response, what they were intending to accomplish. Also, sometimes people say, hey, should I measure failed builds or only successful builds? That's a more complicated detail. You have to look at some of the data. But from the purpose of our signal here, you would say everything, because what did I intend? I intended to get a result, right? I intended to get a result, whether that was a pass or a failure. Now, on the other hand, when I'm in CI, I generally don't intend it to fail. Like I generally intend it to pass, right? Or same thing like with deployments. Deployment is another example of this, right? So the moment that I expressed the intention, please deploy this system, until the moment that that finishes, right? And that one and that's the news. So there's lots of details there, but I've run you through one example. That I could run you through 100, but I think I should stop there.
Amazing. That's very helpful. Yeah. And I think that's sort of like reversing the process, right? Because I think if you start from the metric, sometimes you will realize, oh, that metrics is actually not what I want to measure. For example, like build time versus, from the intention when people want to build things to when it's finished. But if you start from the goals and signals, then it's more systematic. You have basically thought through the process before you come to the metrics. So thank you very much for the examples. And I think that's very helpful.
Max, it's interesting as we're talking about defining metrics and we're defining goals, right? Then we get into the section where you have common pitfalls, right, in the framework. And I thought this section was so interesting because when you talk about common pitfalls, I mean, I've seen this over and over again in different organizations across a variety of different domains, right? So for instance, the whole idea of measuring work versus impact. Right. And I've seen this all the time, right? We want to take a metrics-driven approach, data-driven approach, which is great. But then we get caught up in this cycle of measuring work versus just measuring impact, right? And we see this with lines of code, right? We've talked about how lines of code per developer is a very poor metric, right? For a variety of reasons. It can be bloated and there's no way that it's measuring impact, right? It can be gamed, all of those things. And not just in the development world, but in other kind of industries or domains as well. Like for instance, I have a sales and marketing background. So I see this all the time in large companies when I'm running sales teams, right? We want to take a metrics-driven approach. So there's a focus on metrics, but we end up measuring, again, work versus impact. So for salespeople, it's how many meetings per week, or how many proposals, or how many of these things are implemented into the CRM process, right? Again, it's measuring quantity of work versus actual impact. So I thought that was super interesting pitfall. So how have you successfully avoided this at LinkedIn? Like, how are you building goals and metrics that are really measuring impact versus work? And then the kind of follow-on question is, how do you consistently guard against this over-reliance on metrics, having a healthy balance of metrics and then also like promoting that in a way that's sustainable and you have a nice culture in the organization?
Yeah. Well, part of it is that all of the LinkedIn DPH framework actually comes from internal documents. So it all comes from documents that already existed inside of LinkedIn, and that when people and they all come from, so it always started off with me and my co-author on these things, Grant Jenks, going to having some meeting and somebody being like, we want to have this metric. And we were like, well, I think that that's going to serve you poorly. Like in the end, like I think that, you can implement that, but it's going to take you, months to write that pipeline or whatever, however long it's going to take you. And then at the end of the day, you're going to like go 6 months down the line, and then your executives are going to be like, this doesn't do the thing that I wanted to do. So we're trying to save you all that time. And I think the only like reliable way is there has to be somebody around who understands how to define metrics. So, and that's one of the reasons why I wrote this framework, is so that there can be lots of people in the world who understand how to define metrics and what are the things that they need to know. Because it's really just an issue of upfront knowledge. Like you can try to go through it and have a bad experience, because eventually people figure out that they're making a mistake. Usually, but sometimes it takes years for them to figure out that they're making a mistake. And also, people can get very attached to their metrics, and just they can sort of start to listen to their own song, like just believe their own propaganda about their metric, as opposed to really looking at it and seeing, is it doing something good for me? Is this improving my business? Is it making things better?
Yeah, so that's interesting. And then a kind of a follow-on question to that, another pitfall that you had in there was this whole thing around like behavior change around measurement. So this whole idea of, hey, look, you can't really expect people to change their behavior just so that you can measure it, right? So now you have this metrics-driven approach, but I'm a developer or what have you. I gotta stop and I gotta fill out this form, or I gotta tag this field appropriately, just so that you can measure it and you can like collect some metrics on me, right? And so talk a little bit about that. What's the approach that you found on LinkedIn to get around this pitfall? Is it, hey, convincing people that yes, taking extra time to tag this field or change your behavior is beneficial to you and the organization, and this is why you should do it? Or is it this whole idea of whatever metrics process you come up with, it's got to fit in with the existing behaviors, meaning don't even try to get that developer to change their process or stop to tag that field. And again, I've seen this again in many different places, going back to the sales example. If you ask a salesperson to stop and upload something to the CRM, it's never going to happen. And if you force them to do it, you're just going to get inconsistent data and inconsistent metrics, and it's going to be garbage in, garbage out. So yeah, I'd love to kind of hear how you've solved this problem or addressed this problem at LinkedIn on your teams.
So you have to separate out process changes from metrics measurements. You have to have process changes need to have their own motivations, and they are just like any change you want to make in a human organization. There have to be incentives for the people who operate the process to operate the process correctly. Like it has to benefit them. Like a process that benefits only some distant person who isn't the person operating the process does not function. Or at least not without like extensive policing of the type that like you can't do in any organization of like significant size. So like, let's say that you want to change how people tag bugs, right? Like so that like you're recording root causes or something, right? That's only going to happen correctly if it benefits the people who are doing it in some way. Like if they have some process in their team that they, usually like mandates, in my experience, work on the size of like about a frontline team, sometimes on like a senior manager level team. But like in a large organization, mandates where like you should just do this because I told you to do this don't work.
We've seen that with the return to office mandates that are out there, right?
Yeah, very much so, yeah.
Great. So I would like to also dive into an area that a lot of us care a lot about when it comes to developer productivity and also code quality, which is code reviews. So code reviews is, fundamental in maintaining high quality code and also, fostering collaboration among developers. But they can easily become, bottlenecks if not managed properly. So I remember in your framework, you highlight an interesting point about, code review or response time metric. So focusing more on the speed of individual responses rather than the overall, review time. So I was wondering, how do you encourage faster responses and then without, sacrificing the quality of the review process? Maybe let's start with that. Yeah.
So I am one of the original authors and maintainers of Google's code review guidelines, which are also published and open sourced, which I also open sourced before I left Google. And in that set of documents is a set around speed of code reviews, a set of documents around speed of code reviews, which I wrote with a colleague of mine who helped revise that section. And the essence of it is this. The essence of it is code reviews are higher priority than anything other than your focus time. Your focus time takes priority over code reviews, but code reviews otherwise take priority over everything else. So if at any moment you are interruptible, like you're not coding basically, the first thing you should be working on is a code review, and you should be responding to code reviews right away. Ideally as soon as you get them. Ideally the code review latency is minutes, and in no circumstances should it be longer than 24 hours. Or at least one business day, right? Like it can happen over the weekend. It's fine. But ideally it happens the same day. Like ideally you don't even make it people wait over the weekend.
Got it. And a follow-up question on that is then how do you prevent the risk of sometimes like too many iterations or endless, back and forth in code reviews? And is this an issue like less common that you see, or do you think this is like a more widespread challenge in the industry?
I don't see it that often. I see it in a few situations. One of them is overly nitpicky reviewers. And you can counteract that by establishing a standard. And the standard for code review should be that the overall code health of the system improves when you merge this PR. And as long as you hold that bar with every PR, you will have a good system. The danger is when you start allowing PRs that degrade the code health of the overall system to be merged. But they don't have to be perfect. You're not searching for perfection in every PR.
Yep.
The standard is fairly high. Like literally, if you really think about it, like the system as a whole, its general health, the quality of code should be improving with every PR. But it's not perfection. And okay, so wait, I feel like there were multiple parts to the question. So there's how do you right, that's right. I said there's multiple. So nitpicky solved that way. And one of them is like an educational gap. Like sometimes a very senior person is reviewing the code of a very junior person, and you're going back and forth and back and forth. And the third one is there's something very, very complex that you're reviewing, or something contentious has occurred in the code. Both of those last two situations are solved by face-to-face conversations or meeting, like getting on a Zoom meeting and talking to the person.
Awesome. And then a related follow-up is, how can we make the pull request easier to review? How can we encourage developers to have smaller changes at a time? Is that something there's encourage people to do it, or is there any specific, steps or methodology that people can take to, intentionally make them easier to review for reviewers?
There's so many things. So once again, I have written about this extensively. It is in Google's code review guidelines. A lot of that text was written by me. And so clear change descriptions really help. If it's I keep them small. If it's a little bit larger, write in the description where the person should start, like give them a map of how they should go through it, like what's the main file that they should look at, and then, tell them where to go. And you should learn how to stack PRs. And ideally you have so GitHub is not great for this. It's one of the failings of the GitHub's code review environment. it's not really that great at stacking PRs. But like the ideal workflow that you have is like you make a very small PR, you send it out immediately, and then you immediately start work on the next thing. Like you just create a new branch based on the old PR branch, and you branch off of each PR branch rather than keep branching off of main. And then those are all in a chain, and you can just keep sending them out and say, hey, you should know that, like, these are different, like these are stacked on each other. So each of these, you need to review them in this sequence. But that allows you to keep going forward while also only sending small changes to your reviewer.
Makes sense.
Yeah, hey Max, I wanted to like double down on something we talked about kind of at the beginning of the conversation. So this whole idea around like happiness, right? Developer happiness. So obviously that's very subjective. How do you measure happiness? You may be happy or unhappy in your personal life, but I'm looking at a different type of happiness, right? So one way to measure that, like you talk about, is tying it to productivity. A productive developer is a happy developer. Well, then how do you measure productivity? Because that's also a little bit subjective. And then you obviously come up with, okay, if you're productive, that means you're efficient and effective. And then this is how that breaks down into more specific goals and more specific metrics. So all of that, very logical, very understandable, but it ties back to the premise of a happy developer is a productive developer. Okay. So have you ever found that rule or that law isn't true all the time? Like, can you have a productive team or a happy team that's both, a productive team that's both efficient and effective, but they're not necessarily happy? Like, does happiness equate to productivity always as you've defined it?
So I think one of the things here is that in a way, effective in particular is subjective. You can the only situation that I found that in is when a developer is working on something where they don't value the outcome. And so for them, they don't feel like they're producing anything. Like maybe their leadership values the outcome. And so from the perspective of their leadership, they are productive. And the metrics would indicate they are productive. But the developer is producing something that to them feels valueless. And that my experience is that like developers tend to sort of either be infrastructure developers or product developers. And if you make each of them do the other thing, they tend to get very bored. Like, like product developers are like, I didn't ship anything to 1 million people today. Like when you make them go work on infrastructure, right? And infrastructure developers are like, I'm not providing any leverage to any other people that I work with right now. I'm just moving these buttons around in this UI right now. Like so it's very much like it's that there is that subjective component. That's the only time. Otherwise, all the other situations that I've seen, it goes that happiness follows productivity is usually how it goes. Is usually a productive team that is genuinely productive, being effective is happy. And so happy is actually one of your best signals for determining whether or not the team is productive.
So going back, so again, following through on happiness, right? So Max, right, looking back with your work on the framework, developing the framework, deploying it at LinkedIn, what's been kind of the most rewarding aspect for you, right? Your work on the framework and how it's caused change at LinkedIn. Like, what's the most rewarding aspect for you of seeing that in action?
Anytime anybody comes to me and they just tell me that it helped them.
Yeah.
Like it's really funny, right? Like you work on this engineering org of thousands of people, and like LinkedIn has 1 billion users, but like for me, like the thing that always touches me the most is anytime anybody tells me like, hey, we read this thing that you wrote, or we used this product that you made, and or like, hey, I used this metric and it helped me do something, and I'm just really grateful. That's for me, that's
Amazing. Yeah. Awesome. So we're going to soon open up to all of our audience. So if our audience, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A functionality of our webinar, and then we'll start going through questions with Max together. And I have a last few rapid fire questions. That's usually how we end our DevLogue episode. So yeah, whenever Max is ready, we'll get started with our rapid fire questions. Max, I think you are muted.
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay, awesome. Right, the first one. So what's one concrete advice would you give to team leads who are looking to implement productivity and happiness framework in their team?
Always clarify your goals first.
Got it. Next one. So what's your favorite dev tool that you cannot live without?
There's almost no dev tool in the world that I can't live without. I've been programming for long enough that I have learned the most important skill to have is the ability to learn new skills.
Awesome. Love that answer. So you said almost. So if you if there's one that you really like, what would that be?
That's a great question. I'd have to think about that for a second. I mean, if there was no command line in the world and I had to do everything through a GUI all the time, I think I'd be upset.
Okay.
Actually, in fact, I have done Windows development, and not being able to just go write occasional bash or Perl scripts to automate something like at the command line was difficult for me.
Awesome. So probably your bash shell or something. Okay.
Yeah, it's funny, although I wouldn't recommend bash as a language to other people. But it is a useful shell as a shell.
That ties perfectly to our last question, is that if you could only code in one language for the rest of your career, which one would it be?
Wow. So this depends on whether or not I wanted to be practical or whether I wanted to have fun. If I just wanted to have fun, I would probably write in Ruby, because I just have I just every time I write a line of Ruby, I'm like, that was cool. Look at that. Isn't that cool? And I don't know that it's practical. But I also really love C#, but there's so many things that it's not practical for. But in my viewpoint, C# is the greatest statically typed object-oriented language ever made. But it unfortunately sort of got this brand of being a thing that you make Windows apps with. And it never really penetrated the rest of the programming community. So practically, if I had to, I hope that I would never have to write in just one language. but I feel like those are my current things that I've loved working with the most.
Awesome. Great. So thank you very much, Max. And then with that, we'll open up, to our audience. So yeah, let me quickly also introduce one of our Apache DevLake, community member, Joshua, who has been helping a lot with this webinar. So thank you very much, Joshua. And we'll have Joshua moderate the Q&A session. So Joshua, please take it away.
Thanks, Henry. And thanks, Max and Anmol as well. It was really amazing session. I mean, I've learned a lot, and I'm still reading the DPH framework myself. There are lots of questions I'm sure we'll be encountering. So there's a question from Jim Lesko, who's also a community member. So he asked about how would you introduce metrics and goals to a team that has previously not been exposed to, or is distrustful that type of feedback? I think this is the most interesting question. Max, would you like to answer? Yeah.
That's such a good question.
Yeah.
This is really hard, right? So in developer productivity, especially, or in any kind of infrastructure organization, one of the worst things you can do is lose credibility. And in a way, sometimes the concept of metrics or feedback systems has lost credibility in the past when it has been abused. So coming back from a place where somebody has abused these things is very, very difficult. I think that the thing you need to do is you always need to be solving a problem that people believe exists and that they want solved. So you have to go to them and find out what their problem is and deliver a credible solution to that problem. And so I realize that sometimes there is a power disparity here, because sometimes the people you're measuring are the people who are distrustful, but the people who have the problem are the people in charge. Like the people in charge need a broader overview. In that case, you know, one of the things you can do is you can say, look, we're only going to display aggregate data. We're never going to allow slicing down to the individual level. And you enforce that. You set up you set up security controls on all of the tables. You don't let people query them directly. You only expose the aggregate information. The dashboards never allow slicing down to the level of an individual. That's a compromise that you would make in order to make this culturally acceptable for people. Because the other thing you really don't want to do is you don't want to create incentives for people to cloud your metrics or work around them. And if they feel uncomfortable and they don't like them, or if they're being abused and they're being misused against them, like if people are saying like, hey, you didn't write enough PRs today, you know, to their ICs will behave in ways that will skew the metric until the metric is no longer useful. And so there's a whole section that I wrote here about metrics and performance, basically performance measurement of individuals, and why you should not do that. Like, or at least how to think about, like, if you want to have metrics for performance reviews, there's a good way to do that. But the way to do that is on outcomes, on impact. Measure the impact of the work that those people are doing and show them, and nobody will argue with that. If people argue with that, there's a different problem. Like if I'm like, I need you to have a result and I'm going to measure the result that I need you to have, and they say no, that's a different problem. But if I come to them and I say, oh, I want you to do work and I'm going to measure how much work you're doing and when you're doing it and how you're doing it, I'm going to surveil you, that creates a horrible cultural incentive to mess with you and not do the thing that you want. So there's a good way and a bad way. And I think it's hard to regain that trust. The way you regain the trust is by finding out what the problem is that the people who distrust you have and delivering a real and credible solution to that problem, and making it visible that you delivered a real and credible solution to that problem. Sometimes you have to do a little bit of marketing.
And then so I'm assuming the same advice then to leaders. If I'm a leader and I don't know where to start, you know, and I'm a team lead, I want to prioritize productivity and happiness in my teams, and I want to start adopting that metrics-driven approach, using the same advice to them.
More or less, yes. That's why I suggest to people, if you have no data, you should just start with a survey. The survey is the easiest thing to put together, and it will get you a lot of really useful data right up front. You might find the value of a very simple survey wanes over time. But when you first start it, it's going to be, especially the very simple one, it's going to be very, very valuable. Just ask people like one question about their satisfaction with their, experience of being a developer or whatever, and just give them a free text feedback form and go at it. Like that doesn't require extensive survey design or a lot of complexity to do one time. To do it on an ongoing basis requires more science. But that will tell you what the problem is. Here's the only caution that I will give you. Just like in any software system, your users are not the people who should design your solution. So you, the infrastructure provider, are the architect of the solution. If you're a leader, you, the leader, are the architect of the solution for your team, right? They are telling you what the problem is. Your users are telling you what the problem is, but you decide what the solution is. Data only tells you about the past, okay? Problems are in the past and in the present. Solutions are in the future. And the only thing that tells you about the future is principles. just like laws in the physical sciences, right? Like the law of gravity tells me that if I drop an object, it will fall. I don't have to drop an object to know that it will fall. I can predict that. And there are valid principles in software engineering and in software development and developer productivity that you have to know and apply to develop solutions to the problems. If especially in an enterprise context, if your users come to you and they tell you what they want, like if they tell you a specific solution and you deliver that solution, believe it or not, your users will be unhappy. Eventually, your users will be unhappy. It is the weirdest thing that occurs in an enterprise context. Like, there's all kinds of reasons, right? Like, there's one VP with a very specific way of working, and he wants this very specific solution to his problem. And then later he's gone. And somebody else is there, and she wants that in a different way. But if you, the infrastructure provider, had just thoughtfully designed a solution to the problem as you visualize it, as you see it, because you're the people with all the data from all the different users, you've gathered all the requirements from everybody, only you can actually make the decision. And so if you design a sensible solution that is a good general solution for the problem that you have at hand, for this, a general solution for the specific problem, like very focused on the specific problem that exists, you'll be fine when those things change. You'll be fine.
Fantastic. Awesome. Yeah, if any audience has more questions, feel free to actually just raise your hand and then we can promote you, or you can speak directly, ask directly, and then we can have a conversation together. And I also have another follow-up question. So this might be a hard one, but I was wondering if there are any scenarios where you were implementing the framework, but it's slightly more tricky to navigate. Do you remember any examples from the past?
There are examples. I have to think about, obviously some of these involve internal details of the business. So I have to think about how to talk about them. Some of the most interesting ones are when you want to engage in something that touches outside of engineering. Like when you have to, for example, support processes that engineers experience might be, or like outside of software engineering, let's say you want to be outside of software engineering, right? Like support processes that engineers experience are handled by IT, but they very much affect the life and experience of software engineers. So you might want to be able to understand what that support experience is like. Or like, you can be in very interesting situations. Like, what if you are the team that makes the software that the salespeople use? Okay. And you want to understand the effectiveness and efficiency of the salespeople because that's the impact of your system. But you're not a salesperson. You don't know anything about what they do on a day-to-day basis. Most engineers have no exposure to sales of any kind. They have no idea what it's like, right? But it's very important for them to be able to understand that they're doing a good job. So, and it's a similar thing with IT support. Like IT support, like I was in IT for actually 10 years before I was a software engineer. It's very different than being a software engineer. Being on a help desk, answering tickets, just a whole different life and like what you care about and what matters to you. Just as an example, sometimes IT organizations only measure ticket throughput. They only measure like how many tickets can you close in a unit of time. And if you've ever been on the receiving end of that as the person being supported, you got a lot of really bad support.
Yeah.
You got a lot of just somebody closing a ticket on you that was not solved, and then refusing to reopen it and being like, can you file a new ticket for the exact same problem? As opposed to having some counterbalancing measurement. But you have to work on that. You have to go and find out what are those, what's what's life like for those different types of people. And And, even within engineering, you have that. I think another great example of that is ML engineers or AI engineers. Like, people who work on machine learning systems have a completely different life than other software engineers. So, as an example, there's many ML engineers who their life looks like tweak a hyperparameter in the model, retrain it for 8 hours, and look at the result. But in the middle of that 8 hours, discover there was a typo and have to rerun it and have to it's somewhere in your code because it was all in Python, and like somehow it didn't have a unit test that ran to check that it had a typo. And now you didn't realize that because you went away for 8 hours, and now you're back the next day. And and your output in terms of PRs might be like 1 PR a week. Maybe. But the kind of and the things that are painful for you are like debugging these training runs, or like debugging what we call like the features, basically the data that comes out of various tables that you're pulling out and putting into the model. And like all of the dealing with all the offline flows. And same thing with data scientists, right? Data scientists have very different lives. And so one of the hardest things is also, depending on who your leadership is, they have more experience being certain types of engineers than other types of engineers.
So they're biased.
Yeah, they have built-in biases. And so they can relate more often, often they were Java backend engineers, right? There's a lot of, very successful Java backend engineers who have become, senior tech leads or senior engineers or senior leaders in the world. And so if you tell them about like, hey, there's all this garbage collection issues, they're like, yeah, I know what you're talking about. We need to fix that, right? But if they don't have as much experience with the offline world, you might go and tell them like, we have these data flows and you got to debug them. And they're like, okay, but what? Like, what's that like? I don't understand what that's like, So also, I think getting the empathy there can also be a challenge. And how do you get that empathy is an interesting challenge.
Makes sense.
So I think there's amazing questions coming in from the community. I think like many of them want to start adopting this kind of framework. So there are 2 questions. I'll try to combine it because of time. So one part of the question is, how can I start a DPH framework by Michael? Another part is, it typically take to introduce this way of thinking to establish organization. Like how long does it take for an organization of 300 engineers if they want to start?
For 300 engineers, I would say to have it fully established, probably 2 years. I would guess. So the thing that helps is having some consensus among leaders that they need this data. Like the people who have the power to assign people to do work need to agree that this is a problem that needs to be solved. If they don't agree, you're not going to solve the problem, because there has to be a focused, dedicated effort around this. Otherwise, it will just be a bunch of fractured tables owned by random teams. Then the data quality will never be there. The metrics will always be wrong. And the dashboards will be terrible and unusable. There has to be some focused effort to actually own this. And then once you start it, you need some wins. You need to show people, hey, here's some results. Like you had a problem, here's the data that helps you solve that problem. And then you can use those people as champions, have them talk to other people. While you stay, so it's a balancing act. You need to have immediate deliverables, but you also need to be focused on the long-term outcomes, because what happens is somebody shows up and they're like, hey, how many developers of this level did a deployment in the last 5 days? And you have to already have a table in a pipeline that answers that question, because they're like, and I need that answer like today. you know, and you can't be like, well, now I got to spend 3 months to like implementing all the telemetry to get you that data. So you will have these questions that people like didn't know they wanted. And so there has to be like, the way that I've solved the problem in the past is I've sort of tried to split the way that I've wanted to solve the problem. I didn't necessarily get to do this, but the way that I wanted to solve the problem was split the team. Half the team that is going to work on the metrics team. Half the team is going to work on the long-term infrastructure, and half the team is going to work on immediate customer demands, like deliver products that solve immediate problems. And I think that so, and if you go down that process, you will get there in about 2 years. But I would guess for 300 engineers, 1 to 2 years, like at this, as long as there's also like a continual messaging from the leadership. Somebody has to want the data, and you have to get people to use the data and take action on it. That is really the key.
Fantastic. Use the data and take actions on it. I think that's probably a perfect place for us to wrap up our session today. So I just want to say big thank you to Max for sharing your insights and your amazing work on the LinkedIn Developer Productivity and Happiness Framework. We'd love to, invite you back on the show maybe in some time, and then we can, do a follow-up discussion on some of the topics. And thank you very much for all of our audience for joining us. And I just posted 2 quick links in our webinar chat. So there's first link is the Apache DevLake Slack community. So we have over 1,300 people, community members in the Slack. So if this is the kind of content or content you are interested in, or the problems that you're thinking of on a daily basis, please join us and have this continued discussion in our Slack. And then the second link is our YouTube channel for the DevLogue podcast. So please give us a like and a subscribe. We'll post today's recording on our YouTube channel. Yeah, great to meet everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you in our next episode.
Yeah, one parting thought to you. So I read your framework, and I think it's going to definitely make me a little bit more productive, and it brought a smile to my face. So it made me a little bit happier too. So
well, thanks so much. This was great.
All right.
Thanks, Max.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good one.